So after removing material from the seam and sanding them down, it's time to resculpt the seam and hopefully make them nigh on invisible. This work is accomplished by using a very thick mix of hydro-resin and applying it over the seam using a metal spatula. Any tool will work, but I choose to use metal since the hydro-resin doesn't stick to the metal tool too much before it sets, and after it sets, it can be removed from the tool using sanding tools, essentially, or a knife, without destroying the tool. That is, if you forget to properly clean the tool before the resin is set up, which you can do with water, of course, since the resin is water soluble, and you should do that. Now, depending on the material you are casting in, this casting method can be used with a variety of material, and depending on what material you are using, your mileage may vary here. If you tried doing similar things to this in plaster, it would certainly work, but it would require quite a different approach and cause several different issues. The main one to consider if you are using plaster, which I'm sure a lot of you will be, is that new plaster will dry out really quickly on the surface of your casting because the dry plaster of the cast will suck a lot of the moisture out of the freshly applied plaster, leaving you with a really bad bond and sort of this dry, dusty plaster that doesn't bond to the surface and just sort of crumbles off. A good solution to this issue is to wet your cast before applying the fresh plaster to resculpt the seam. Now, with Hydro-resin, this particular brand of resin, we have no such issues, however, and we're rather free to simply apply a thick mix of resin to the surface without any issue with the resin bonding to the surface. It will bond without any problem. Hydro-resin can be mixed really thickly by adding more of the powder component, which is nice. Some other brands of composite casting resins won't allow you to do that. They'll require thixotropic additives, which is essentially a thickener, to accomplish the same goal as we're getting to here. Hydro-resin is great because it maintains a decent set time even when mixed really thickly and doesn't seem to get too much of a different texture when sanding compared to when mixed regularly. It doesn't become a lot harder essentially, though it does become a little bit harder than the regular mixture. A thick mix is nice and probably required because we can sculpt with it, and we need to be able to do that since we would like to resculpt the same texture that our sculpture has along the seam lines. And we also don't want hydro-resin sort of running everywhere, so we need to make a thick mix. If we simply apply the hydro-resin on the seam and along the seam and smooth it out completely, and the sculpture has texture, then the seam will stand out as we'll have this broad line, this highway, running around our sculpture with smooth texture, and everywhere else will have sculpted, hand-sculpted texture. That'll stand out like a sore thumb. I tend to add a little more than I need to add to the surface first, then I'll remove the excess, and during that removal process, I'll try to incorporate some texture into it. It's very difficult to perfectly mimic the texture of the sculpture, so I will often oversculpt the texture a little bit, making it a bit more obvious and strong than everywhere else. Then, once it's set, I can sand that excess texture down a little bit, and it will look like the sculpted texture I have everywhere else, sort of blending in seamlessly, hopefully. Removing as much excess material as possible is important because I want this to be a linear process where I do each step once and not multiple times. If I add too much to repair the seam now, I'll have to use the Dremel tool again, and I don't want to do that. By having a fairly flat tool that's smooth, I can use the existing surface around the seam to register the height of the freshly added material too. This allows for a pretty exact amount to be added, an amount that won't show up and cause issues for me later down the line. It won't be this little bump on the surface, it'll be even with the rest of the surface. And anything I can do to make sure the Dremel tool doesn't get brought out again is something that I'm intent on doing. As I mentioned, I prefer metal tools because of the longevity they provide in comparison to wood tool when using resin. Wood tools do work well with hydro-resin, but they are more susceptible to being damaged if the resin is not removed before it sets up on the tool. Having water nearby and also a sharp X-Acto knife that you can use to clean the tool regularly is going to help quite a bit. The tool getting sort of gummed up with dry resin is really annoying, and it will impede your ability to get a decent surface, or at least impede your ability to control the surface and the texture that you are trying to create. I like the long and narrow teardrop shaped tool, as it's pretty much the same tool that I will use for regular sculpting, but tools are really all about personal preference, and you can probably get used to using any tool as long as you stick with the same shape for a long period of time. Because I sculpt with similarly shaped tools, I find using the spatula to be fairly natural for me, even though my sculpting tools are wood and not metal. Water can dissolve the resin as it is a water-soluble material. This is great since you can clean your tools using water and clean anything else for that matter, your hands, your bowls, whatever it might be, your brushes. Water can be used, and I'm using it here as a solvent to take down some of the texture that the tool introduces into the resin when you're sculpting. The water works in many ways like it would on water-based clay, or how mineral spirits or alcohols would work on an oil-based clay, for example. It dissolves the resin and allows for a more even and smooth transition between where the resin is applied and the surrounding surface areas. A very annoying feature that can occur is this little edge, a little lip where the freshly resculpted area meet the old area. And sometimes sanding this edge smooth or even doesn't work so well. It sort of cracks off and becomes worse. But by using water, we can blend the edge of the new resin into the old resin and create an almost invisible seam between the two. Since we oversculpted the texture, we can now try to properly integrate the newly resculpted areas into the texture of the surrounding areas. It's not magic at all. A fairly smooth sandpaper around 100 grit or so, maybe a little bit more, will do the trick here. I try my best to work in a way where we don't get flat spots anywhere, and the best way that I've found to do this is to work in a circular motion. This sort of keeps the sandpaper moving and helps me not stay in one spot for too long, which would of course flatten that spot out more than the surrounding areas, making it obvious that this has been retouched.